Hello everyone and welcome to Tea and Books, once again taking place in the big comfy chair. And I really hope it's a gorgeous day out there right now, so I really hope that people are out there enjoying the lovely sunshine and beautiful day. And you can always catch up with Tea and Books later. Just want to let you know, put that out there, you know, leave now, go for a walk, enjoy the day, come back and watch this in the evening or someday when it's raining. At any point, welcome. Today, the tea that I am drinking is Genmaicha, one of my favorites. So it's just green tea with lovely roasted rice in it. So it has a nice warm nutty flavor. And it's one of my favorites. It's from David's Tea. So I'm ready. If you are still here and you are still watching, maybe you've already had your fill of the sunshine for today, then welcome. Let me know what kind of tea you're drinking today. And you can even let me know what kind of, books you're reading right now. Today I have 3 books to talk about, and they're all drastically different from one another. So this should be a lot of fun today. The first book I'm gonna talk a little bit about is just a lovely sort of cozy story if you just want to be transported a bit. It is, ta-da, The Jane Austen Society by Natalie Jenner. If you haven't already had a chance to read this book, it's really nice. It's probably a good book for people who liked the Guernsey Literary and Potato Peel Pie Society. It's set in sort of a post-war time period, although it leaps around a little bit. And it's set in the small English village of Chawton. So if you are not a huge Jane Austen file, you may not realize that Chawton is where Jane Austen lived and wrote, especially in her final home was there. And so this story centers all around the people who live in that community, how they feel about all of the sort of fans who are starting to come and visit the village looking for traces of Jane Austen and sort of what's left behind. So you get really introduced to this lovely local cast of characters and some who are not local, like a movie star. And it's just a really delightful story about Jane Austen. So I would really recommend it for anybody who is a Jane Austen fan. It certainly made me feel like turning around and reading all the Jane Austen books back to back to catch up. But it's really a book where the author's love of Jane Austen and Jane Austen's writing speaks through the characters in a really lovely way. So it's not like the many books that we've seen that are sort of new versions of Jane Austen's novels. This one is really its own story, but it's certainly full of lots of love for Jane Austen, lots of information about her life, and just wonderful fans that are just very heartwarming in their characters and their stories. So I'm going to read a little bit of this one for you. For those who are just joining us, the book that I'm reading from right now is The Jane Austen Society by Natalie Jenner. And that's our first book of 3 that I'm going to talk about today. Dr. Gray permitted himself one night a week to indulge a passion he had shared with his late wife, a bus trip into the neighboring town of Alton to see the newest movie release. The rest of his free time he spent trying to distract himself from thinking about Jenny. But now, when the movie house lights dimmed and the couples slouched against each other even farther still, he allowed himself to picture his beloved wife and their own nights out at the cinema together. She had always wanted to see the Weepies, those woman-centered films starring such actresses as Katharine Hepburn and Barbara Stanwyck, and he would sometimes put up a little fuss, a little push for a Western or a gangster film. But he always ended up enjoying her choices as much as she did. Sometimes they would even skip the bus after and walk home the hour and a half in moonlight instead, talking over the film they had just seen. He couldn't wait to hear what she had to say. He had always loved her most for her mind, and he was smart enough to know that she was much smarter than him. She had been one of the few women at his college and had spent equal time in the library and in the lab. Her sharp mathematical mind could have been a real asset to the war effort, but this was one of many things about her that he would never know. She had died 4 years earlier from a simple fall down the stairs leading to their bedroom, hitting her head in the absolute worst way on the one jutting part of the lowest stair that he had always meant to fix. The internal bleeding was swift and acute, and he had been completely unable to save her. A doctor who can't save his own wife achieves an unfortunate degree of notoriety to add to the grief and self-recrimination. No one was ever going to be harder on him than himself, but his professional pride often caused him to wonder if the other villagers might not blame him too. As he passed the trio of women chatting excitedly in front of the little white gate to the Austen cottage, he tipped his hat at them. He was not one of the villagers who considered them to be a nuisance, to be wished away. Every person who made their village a site of pilgrimage was keeping alive the legacy and the aura of Austen. And as a lifelong fan himself, he appreciated that the villagers were involuntary caretakers of something much bigger than they could guess at. He was turning onto the old Gosport Road that led to the great house and neighboring Knight estate when he saw a fellow member of the school board approaching him from that same direction. They tipped their hats at each other. Then the other man started in at a clip. "Glad I ran into you, Benjamin. Having a problem again at the school." Dr. Gray sighed. The new teacher. The other man nodded. "Yes, young Miss Lewis, as you surmised. She has those boys on a steady diet of lady authors from as far back as the 1700s. Can't make her see reason." He paused. "Thought she might listen to you." "Because why?" "Well, for one thing, you're closest in age to her. Not by much. And besides, you seem to have a pretty good grasp of her, teaching methods." Dr. Gray's eyes narrowed imperceptibly. "I've been the doctor here for many years now, and I would like to think I have a pretty good understanding of everyone in the village. It doesn't necessarily follow that I have any particular influence over them." "Just give it a try, That's a good man." Dr. Gray did not think he could persuade Adeline Lewis of anything. He did know that his fellow school board trustees, all male, all well into their 50s and beyond, were a little afraid of the young woman only one term into her first teaching job. Adeline was very confident in her lesson plans and highly resistant to anyone trying to manage her. She also physically matched most of the men for height, which was not difficult to do since only Dr. Gray was anywhere close to 6 feet tall. But perhaps most unnerving of all, Adeline Lewis was attractive in a way that sneaked up on all of them until they started to forget what they had come to say. She would stare straight in the eyes of the various board members, always ready to speak her mind, always up for a fight, and they each inevitably gave in to her. Dr. Gray shook his head in remonstrance whenever one of them opened their monthly board meetings with yet another tale of capitulation. "Well," he replied tentatively, looking around as if hoping to see someone lying injured in the street and in need of his medical services instead, "I suppose I could stop in there now." "There's a fellow," the other man smiled. "You're sure we're not keeping you from anything?" Dr. Gray shook his head. "No, just out for a walk to clear my head." The other man tipped his hat again and continued on his way, cheerfully calling back, "Doubt having to set Miss Lewis straight will help with any of that." Dr. Gray hesitated, turned to look back at his colleague, then forged on ahead until he reached the old Victorian schoolhouse across the village from the cricket pitch. He supposed class would be ending right now at 3:30 p.m. Sure enough, when he strolled into the vacated senior classroom, he found Adeline Lewis standing at the chalkboard, chalk in hand, half writing and half gesturing to a young girl sitting at the teacher's desk as if she belonged there. Dr. Gray noticed a copy of Virginia Woolf in the student's hands. "Marriage as a social contract to avoid poverty was written in bright white letters across both sides of the chalkboard. Dr. Gray sighed again, and Adeline must have heard him because she whirled about. "You've been sent to scold me," she said with a smile, but it was a smile of the knowing, not the vanquished, and he felt his jaw automatically tighten. "Not to scold, to understand. A steady diet of woman writers, Adeline? Really? For a room full of adolescent boys?" Adeline looked down at the girl sitting at the desk who had closed her Virginia Woolf and was now watching the two adults with unabashed interest. "Not just boys, Dr. Gray. You know Miss Stone?" Dr. Gray nodded. "How are you, Evie? How's your father?" "He's doing a lot of reading," Evie spoke up. "Miss Lewis gave him a list of books to cheer him, and he's working through it from the library one by one." Dr. Gray cocked one eyebrow at Miss Lewis as if stumbling upon evidence helpful to his cause. "I'd like to see that list sometime, if I may." "Hardly," replied Adeline with a slight frostiness to her tone. "I am judged enough around here for my choices." So you get a little bit of a flavor of that. These are two of the characters that end up becoming part of the society. And it's, like I say, it's a delightful read, post-war, rural England, very, very entertaining and full of lovely characters. So I would really recommend that one as a bit of an escape right now. And then I am going to talk next about something completely different. Hench by Natalie Zena Walschatz. So Hench was one of the books for Canada Reads 2021 this year, which I found absolutely fascinating. So it's a little bit out of the ordinary in that it's very much a book that would appeal to people who like comic books. To be clear, it's not a graphic novel. It is fiction. It's a novel, but it is a story that is just delightful in the depth of its attention to a sort of comic book universe. So Hench, as you can imagine, hench refers to henchman or henchwoman. So basically our main character, Anna, works for a temp agency henching. So she works for villains who need people to, work in their office or drive the getaway car or anything like that. And so you get a little taste for her as a character, the reason that she got into that work. She is a very interesting person who is a little offbeat, and the book just does a really good job sort of examining a lot of the ideas that we have about who's good and who's a hero and who's bad and who's a villain, like some other stories have done. But in this case, it very much ends up with her getting sidetracked after she gets caught in an accident, basically, where she is just showing up in an innocent way as someone who happens to work for this villain, and she gets very badly injured in a fight where she is just basically casually brushed aside by one of the world's biggest superheroes, and her injury and her recovery from her injury gets her thinking a lot about heroes and superheroes and what they cost the world and how many other people might like her have experienced injury, loss of work, and other bad fallout from having been saved by a superhero. And in her adventures in the story, she unwillingly sort of turns into a very interesting villain herself, in trying to create ways of taking down the superheroes that are completely well, it's done in a way that doesn't hurt people as much as possible, physically hurt people. So it's a very, very interesting exploration, and she's a fascinating character, and getting to know more about this interesting superhero world from her perspective is, it was just kind of delightful and fun. And the whole way it's written and everything is a little bit different. So it's written more like you're almost reading a comic, only not. I don't know. It's just a very different book. And I was very happy to see it on the Canada Reads list because I thought it was a lot of fun that they were including a book like this that wasn't sort of serious. It was different and entertaining and a little bit fresh, I would say. So at any rate, I'll read a little bit from her first. She's been called to let her know that their temp agency is doing this sort of open call for a bunch of different people. So she's on her way there for this sort of interview process, and she meets up with one of her friends who also works for the temp agency, and this is just a little bit more about that. I spotted June a block away from the temp agency, tucked around a corner to keep out of the line of sight from anyone in the building. I asked Oscar to drop me off there. Her body was curled against the intense February chill, her face turned toward the brick wall in front of her. Her smart navy blue trench coat was too light for the weather, and the tips of her fingers were shaking from the cold as she held a cigarillo. June had been henching longer than I had. She dipped a toe in the dastardly end of the freelance world for the first time almost 3 years ago, and had been invaluable when I followed suit. She was the first person to admit to me that she worked as a hench, and surprised me by generously helping me through my temp agency application. I was a shaking mess before my first intake interview, expecting a room full of hardened and battle-scarred evildoers. There was a remarkable lack of black lycra and metal masks when I finally walked through the doors, though just desperate temps who looked as likely to have decent typing speeds as Demolition's experience. She made fun of me relentlessly for being so scared, and we quickly became inseparable. She'd hit a rough patch recently, much longer and deeper than my raid-related few weeks out of work. June had powers, and her skill set was extremely specific. That meant she was both expensive and niche. Feast or famine. There had been too much of the latter, too little of the former. Her shoulders, even hunched against the cold, showed a lot of tension. I unfolded myself from the cab and strode towards her, clearing my throat so I wouldn't startle her. She flicked her cigarillo into a small pile of filthy snow, and I heard it sizzle. She reached for the coffee with grabby hands. Her eyes were a little bloodshot. "You look like crap," she said. She took a sip of the latte, leaving lipstick marks on the plastic top of the to-go mug. "Probably," I agreed too cheerfully. "They give you any idea what to expect?" "Nope, just that something fit my profile. They tell you anything?" She shook her head. "Same as you." She took another swallow and flinched. "Ugh, drinking this is like eating a vanilla pod." "I told them to go light on the syrup. Sorry." "It's fine." June's voice seemed especially weary. She had an advanced sense of smell and taste, which sometimes made her vulnerable as a hench, but usually just made her life miserable, especially in the city. There was a shine right under her nose. She'd spread mint chapstick there, a trick doctors and coroners used beneath surgical masks to block out some of the odors around her. "Ugh. No one tells you how much super senses hurt," she explained once. "It's agony. You know, some lucky jerks can't feel pain. Like, not as an ability. Their pain receptors don't work. So you get these toddlers breaking toes and chewing off their own tongues before they learn to stop messing with themselves. Turns out, if you can't feel pain, you can't smell anything either. Think about a bad smell, how you recoil from it like it hurts. It's like that for me all the time." We'd both been drunk, and I babbled about how sorry I was until she threw what was left of her drink at me. She was even worse at feelings than I was. She'd been wearing nose plugs to the bar that night like a swimmer. She never said so, but I suspected the reason June moved to henching in the first place was that the work she tended to get evil doing was generally less unpleasant. She worked for the Border Patrol once to sniff out explosives in the airport. Mostly she found coke and contraband cured meats. She was miserable there, surrounded by the smells of body and breath, of everyone coming off long flights, of dirty clothes, of airport food. There was also the aroma of panic and exhaustion. Mostly, though, she hated dealing with cops. Now she helped villains design packaging her sense of smell couldn't penetrate, or sniffed their drinks at parties to make sure the liquid hadn't been dosed. In between jobs, she smoked like a chimney, dampening her sense of smell and taste in tiny, merciful increments. "Let's go inside," I said, drinking my coffee and watching her shake. She shrugged. "Let's get it over with." I pushed the heavy doors open and we walked through them together, the heels of our boots clicking in time on the wet tile floor. The temp agency's reception desk was in a long, bleak room. Smaller, windowless interview rooms branched off of it, reminding me of holding cells. One of the sickly fluorescent lights flickered. My eye twitched. There weren't many of us there that morning, barely a dozen, in moody coats and unnecessary sunglasses and sharp-shouldered suits, chipped manicures and threaded eyebrows, all doing what we could to cast the illusion we were intimidating. No one was sitting. 2 temp wranglers sat behind the desk, a man in an ill-fitting blue suit who was trying to make himself look less baby-faced by growing a thin blonde beard, and a frighteningly neat woman with glossy black hair pecking irritably at a tablet. June and I elbowed our way closer to the front of the pack, making a point of taking up space while trying not to look too keen. I smiled at a man in what appeared to be low-key, hard-boiled detective cosplay when he glared at me. "How bad do you think it's going to be?" I asked June quietly. "Abysmal." "Half of us leaving without work?" She tossed her head, gesturing to the hench hopefuls behind us. "At least. I say 2/3 walk out of here with nothing." The man in the blue suit stood and muttering around me quieted. I stood a little straighter. "Where are our drivers?" he asked. 3 people stepped forward, a broad-shouldered blonde woman with a buzz cut and 2 young men who scowled at each other, both wearing leather jackets and white t-shirts. Their matching, perfect pompadours trembled as they eyed each other aggressively, like the wattles on a pair of roosters. "Wore the same dress to the prom, I see," June said in my ear, and I nearly choked on the coffee in my mouth. The woman looked up from her tablet. Her eyes were sharp black. "We need a chauffeur with first-class getaway. Who has a stunt background?" The blonde woman raised her hand. "I'm certified." She dropped her arm back to her side. Her dress shirt was rolled up on her forearms and her biceps strained the material. It made my stomach flutter. "I have a lot of on-set work, mostly commercials. You got references?" "Of course." "Let's head out to the track." The blue-suited man started to walk out of the room, gesturing for her to follow. He paused to glance back at the 2 men who looked even more deflated than they had moments before. "Sorry, guys. Next time." The 2 disappointed drivers turned to leave at the same time and had to endure the awkwardness of stomping out together, both refusing to pause and let the other go first. "It'll be a summer wedding," I predicted. June choked on her coffee. The woman with short hair followed the blue suit out back of the temp agency. I watched her carefully close the heavy doors so they wouldn't make too much noise behind her. I imagined her being led to the supercar she'd be driving for the rest of the day. If she was any good at all, I expected the job would be permanent. Good drivers got snapped up and were relatively rare. I found myself hoping I wouldn't see her back, that she'd get a good assignment and have a long lifespan, though I realized with a small pang that would mean I wouldn't get to look at her well-muscled arms again. I always found it sad when someone kept turning up at the agency every few weeks looking for more work. Like me. The remaining temp wrangler was spitting out assignments rapid fire. Most of them were skills specific. A call for a safe cracker, another for a network security specialist. That last one made me scan the crowd for a face I knew. "Where the hell is Greg?" I said a little louder than I meant to. That's a perfect job for him. June opened her mouth to answer, but then the woman with the tablet said she needed someone with exceptional sensory perception, and June's attention swung away from me and toward the promise of work. They discussed details I couldn't make out, and after a few minutes, June signed the surface of the tablet with the tip of one finger. She walked back looking positively jolly. 6 weeks on site, possibility of extension, she told me, sweeping her box braids back over her shoulder and rubbing the back of her neck to get rid of some of the tension she'd been carrying. On site, though. Yeah, see, I'm not a coward like you. I'm sorry, I'm still rather attached to my mortal well-being. Still, eh? Anna, traumaed love? I glared at June instead of responding and walked to the desk to get my assignment. It was too late to correct the way the temp wrangler had said my name, but it still annoyed the crap out of me. I forced a rictus smile. We have a remote data entry assignment if you're interested. The tone of her voice indicated she didn't think I would be, but she was wrong. I was willing to stoop to all manner of soul-destroying work that didn't require me to put on clothes. Just what I'm looking for. Mercifully, she didn't bother making eye contact. Sign here. You'll be emailed login credentials, 60 hours to start with the possibility of indefinite extension. There was something about the way she said it that indicated she felt she'd given out a sentence. I like the sound of that. She rolled her eyes. So that's the beginning of Anna's job experience that ends up getting her in the way of a superhero. But like I said, it's a very interesting book. It's very different. It's fresh. I haven't read anything quite like it before, outside of comics, that is. And I just wanted to include that one just because I think it's really nice. It's a change of pace, and I found it a lot of fun. So if you do like comic books and superheroes and villains, and especially if you like anti-heroes, then this book is really, really up your alley, and I would recommend it. So the final book I'm going to talk about today is quite different. It's nonfiction, and it is The Code Breaker by Walter Isaacson. So some of you may know Walter Isaacson. He's very, very famous for his biographies. He's done Steve Jobs, he's done Leonardo da Vinci, he's done all kinds of really well-known biographies that have been very, very popular. So this is his newest work. It's a very interesting one. So the Code Breaker, the woman on the cover there that you can see in the picture, is Jennifer Doudna. So Jennifer Doudna was one of 2 recipients in 2020 of the Nobel Prize for CRISPR. So if you don't know about CRISPR, if you haven't heard about it already, it's very exciting. It's all based around genetic science and the many leaps that have been made forward in the past few years in that. And CRISPR basically allows people to go in and edit proteins and make changes, genetic changes within the body. So for example, it can be used, one of the things they're researching right now is using it to address, just flew out of my mind, anemia, sickle cell anemia. So sickle cell anemia affects millions of people all over the globe, and it is all based around a single gene. So this is something that now they may be able to address and actually go in and make changes. It's kind of terrifying and exciting at the same time, the things they're able to do with CRISPR. And in fact, you may have heard a little bit about it with all of the COVID vaccinations right now, because 2 of the main vaccines, Moderna and Pfizer, that are being used right now are what's known as mRNA vaccines, and that uses some of the same CRISPR technology. So Jennifer Doudna, who this book talks about quite a bit and sort of gives you a background of her life. When she was quite young, one of the first things that she did before CRISPR was she actually took one of the first photos that allowed them to actually get a good idea of the structure of RNA. One of the big difficulties, as you can imagine, in science is the fact that people are now dealing with things that are so small that they're very, very difficult to get a picture of. And sometimes many of these things are theoretical initially, and they don't have a good idea of what they're actually made of unless they can get a good idea of the structure. So Jennifer Doudna was the first person to nail down the structure of RNA, and then that led to all of these other developments that led to CRISPR, which led to all of this exciting medical technology that's happening right now. So I did have to go back when I was reading it and brush up a little bit on my high school biology, just to have a better idea of all that I was reading about. But it's a very exciting book. He talks about genetic editing. He talks about CRISPR. He talks about everything that Jennifer Doudna has done, but he also talks about the race that's on in this area right now, with all kinds of different scientists trying to sort of break through and be the next one to make the next great discovery. So there's a certain excitement in that. And he also spends a lot of time in one of the later chapters talking about the ethical questions, the moral and ethical questions about genetic editing, especially if it's done obviously in an embryonic way. So in other words, what might happen someday if this becomes something that is used before babies are born. Currently, that is not permitted anywhere in the world, but he talks a little bit about all of the scientists who are working right now to develop ethics around this and what the future might bring. So it's a fascinating book. I really would recommend it because I found out so much about this area, and it's still so new. It's really only been in the past 10 years that this has been moving very quickly forward. So it's really exciting to find out more about it, especially now because I think obviously in the past year or so, most of the news that we've been hearing has been about the pandemic. So sometimes we've missed out on some of these exciting scientific developments, and this book is great to catch you up on some of those things. So I'm just going to read a fairly short part from this book because, as you can imagine, with the content, it sometimes, you know, you have to really read it yourself because you want to take in the more scientific aspects of it. But right now I'm just going to focus on something that's a little bit more biographical. So this is talking a little bit about Doudna's youth. She grew up in Hawaii. Doudna and her best friend Lisa spent their afternoons riding bikes and hiking through sugarcane fields. The biology was lush and diverse, moss and mushrooms, peach and orenga palms. They found meadows filled with lava rocks covered in ferns. In the lava flow caves there lived a species of spider with no eyes. How, Doudna wondered, did it come to be? She was also intrigued by a thorny vine called hila hila, or sleeping grass, because its fern-like leaves curled up when touched. I ask myself, she recalls, what causes the leaves to close when you touch them? We all see nature's wonders every day, whether it be a plant that moves or a sunset that reaches with pink fingers into a sky of deep blue. The key to true curiosity is pausing to ponder the causes. What makes a sky blue or a sunset pink or a leaf of sleeping grass curl? Doudna soon found someone who could help answer such questions. Her parents were friends with a biology professor named Don Hemis, and they would all go on nature walks together. We took excursions to Waipio Valley and other sites on the Big Island to look for mushrooms, which was my scientific interest, Hannes recalls. After photographing the fungi, he would pull out his reference books and show Doudna how to identify them. He also collected microscopic shells from the beach, and he would work with her to categorize them so they could try and figure out how they evolved. Her father bought her a horse, a chestnut gelding named Mokahana after a Hawaiian tree with a fragrant fruit. She joined the soccer team playing halfback, a position that was hard to fill on her team because it required a runner with long legs and lots of stamina. That's a good analogy to how I've approached my work, she said. I've looked for opportunities where I can fill a niche where there aren't too many other people with the same skill sets. Math was her favorite class because working through proofs reminded her of detective work. She also had a happy and passionate high school biology teacher, Marlene Hapai, who was wonderful at communicating the joy of discovery. She taught us that science was about a process of figuring things out, Doudna says. Although she began doing well academically, she did not feel that there were high expectations in her small school. I didn't get the sense that the teachers really expected very much of me, she said. She had an interesting immune response. The lack of challenges made her feel free to take more chances. I decided you just have to go for it because what the hell, she recalled. It made me more willing to take on risks, which is something I later did in science when I chose projects to pursue. Her father was the one person who pushed her. He saw his oldest daughter as his kindred spirit in the family, the intellectual who was bound for college and an academic career. I always felt like I was the son that he wanted to have, she says. I was treated a bit differently than my sisters. Doudna's father was a voracious reader who would check out a stack of books from the local library each Saturday and finish them by the following weekend. His favorite writers were Emerson and Thoreau, but as Jennifer was growing up, he became more aware that the books he assigned to his class were mostly by men. So he added Doris Lessing, Ann Tyler, and Joan Didion to his syllabus. Often he would bring home a book either from the library or the local secondhand bookstore for her to read. And that is how a used paperback copy of James Watson's The Double Helix ended up on her bed one day when she was in 6th grade, waiting for her when she got home from school. She put the book aside thinking it was a detective tale. When she finally got around to reading it on a rainy Saturday afternoon, she discovered that she was right, in a sense. As she sped through the pages, she became enthralled with what was an intensely personal detective drama, filled with vividly portrayed characters about ambition and competition in pursuit of nature's inner truths. When I finished, my father discussed it with me, she recalls. He liked the story and especially the very personal side of it, the human side of doing that kind of research. In the book, Watson dramatized and over-dramatized how, as a 24-year-old bumptious biology student from the American Midwest, he ended up at Cambridge University in England, bonded with biochemist Francis Crick, and together won the race to discover the structure of DNA in 1953. Written in the sparky narrative style of a brash American who had mastered the English after-dinner art of being self-deprecating and boastful at the same time, the book manages to smuggle a large dollop of science into a gossipy narrative about the foibles of famous professors, along with the pleasures of flirting, tennis, lab experiments, and afternoon tea. In addition to the role of lucky knife that he concocted as his own persona in the book, Watson's other most interesting character is Rosalind Franklin, a structural biologist and crystallographer whose data he used without her permission. Displaying the casual sexism of the 1950s, Watson refers to her condescendingly as Rosie, a name she never used, and pokes fun at her severe appearance and chilly personality. Yet he is also generous in his respect for her mastery of the complex science and beautiful art of using X-ray diffraction to discover the structure of molecules. I guess I noticed she was treated a bit condescendingly, but what mainly struck me was that a woman could be a great scientist, Doudna says. It may sound a bit crazy, I guess. I must have heard about Marie Curie, but reading the book was the first time I really thought about it, and it was an eye-opener. Women could be scientists. The book also led Doudna to realize something about nature that was at once both logical and awe-inspiring. There were biological mechanisms that governed living things, including the wondrous phenomena that caught her eye when she hiked through the rainforest. Growing up in Hawaii, I had always liked hunting with my dad for interesting things in nature, like the sleeping grass that curls up when you touch it, she recalls. The book made me realize that you could also hunt for the reasons why nature worked the way it did. Doudna's career would be shaped by the insight that is at the core of the double helix. The shape and structure of a chemical molecule determine what biological role it can play. It is an amazing revelation for those who are interested in uncovering the fundamental secrets of life. It is the way that chemistry, the study of how atoms bond to create molecules, becomes biology. In a larger sense, her career would also be shaped by the realization that she was right when she first saw the double helix on her bed and thought that it was one of those detective mysteries that she loved. "I've always loved mystery stories," she noted years later. "Maybe that explains my fascination with science, which is humanity's attempt to understand the longest-running mystery we know, the origin and function of the natural world and our place in it." So like I say, I found it a really fascinating book. It really helped me discover a lot about science and recent scientific discoveries and where we're heading. So again, it's Walter Isaacson's latest biography. It's called The Code Breaker, Jennifer Doudna, Gene Editing, and the Future of the Human Race. So that's quite an exciting title. So that's my last book, and I'm just going to refresh for anybody who joined us late that the first book that I talked about today was The Jane Austen Society by Natalie Jenner, and our second book was called Hench by Natalie Zena Walschatz. So thank you for joining me today. I hope you enjoyed hearing about these books, and I hope you are able to get out there and enjoy the sunshine today. Thanks a lot, and our next Tea and Books will be on June the 3rd, and it will be Kyle. So I'll see you all later. Have a great day.